Good morning. This will finish up our lesson on Daniel and his three friends. We're going to focus on Daniel now. This has been I like these kind of lessons. They're easy, telling the story, drawing some attention to some details, making some application. Next week we're going to spend some time going back a few chapters and look at Nebuchadnezzar and how that can apply to our life and the things that he went through and the progression through his life in seeing and interacting with these four men of faith and the struggles that he went through that he could avoid, but in the end came through, I think, better for it. Daniel, though, is kind of one of those books that you learn about in Bible class, one of those fun characters to study of faith in the Bible. Hey, yeah, there's some scary stuff in the book of Daniel that you can get wrong. Some passages of scriptures, some visions that Daniel has that careful study is required, and understanding of not just what Daniel sees, but also an understanding of what was going on in the world at that time. We don't need to worry about it. And really, when you understand that the point of those visions that Daniel has concerning Israel, concerning Jerusalem, the 70 weeks, and all that kind of stuff, when it gets down to it, the whole point is God's going to be victorious. And those who are on his side are victorious. That's the whole point of it. A lot of the stuff that we see in the book of Daniel is mirrored in the book of Revelation. And another one of those tough books sometimes that kind of makes us get a little scared to study, that we're going to get it wrong or whatever. And at the end of the day, if we understand that God's victorious and those who are on his side are going to be victorious, then we got it right. Daniel, though, this is in his last stage of his life. We've seen him as a young man with Nebuchadnezzar, and when he was first taken into captivity and brought before the king's court, and him and his three friends decide they are not going to defile themselves. And then we spent some time last week with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and their willingness to not bend, not yield, not put themselves in a position of even appearing like they're going to worship God or another God instead of the one true God. Well, now we skip ahead quite a bit here. And I mentioned a couple weeks ago that the book of Daniel is one of those books that the timeline's kind of goofy. We're not really sure exactly when things happen, how much time passes between each chapter, and a lot of it's not even in order. We're here at the end of Daniel's life, nearing the end of his life, 80 years old at this point. We know that because we know when Nebuchadnezzar was on the throne in Babylon, and we know when the Medes and the Persians came in and took over Babylon. And we're here in chapter 6 in Daniel with a guy named Darius. No introduction is given, no indication of any kind of time passing other than the last chapter. We see this writing on the wall, or rather the last ruler, Belshazzar, who was having this big party, and the handwriting on the wall where this just disembodied hand is scribbling this message on the wall. We don't really see any kind of introduction here for this guy named Darius. There's some speculation as to exactly who he is, but we're going to say that this was a title for Cyrus. The Cyrus that has the largest army, has the largest empire, a very important person in world history. And we're going to see here that this could have been his general and is just sort of a military governor over the province of Babylon. But what's important for us to understand is that whoever this is, Daniel did have interaction with Cyrus, King Cyrus the Great. And Daniel had a positive influence as a result. Daniel had an influence over this king to the extent where he signed a decree to allow the Jews to go back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Allowing Jews to go back and inhabit the land, to build the temple. Later, Jesus born in Bethlehem. Now, God's will would have been done regardless. Regardless if Daniel had been the kind of person that he was supposed to be, God's will would have been done. But how great is it to think that this one person here, through a simple act of being faithful to God through all things, influenced world history in such a way that it's known not just because we read about it in the Bible, but in a way that we know what happened because how massive these things were into history that we know about them today. Outside of the Bible. And so Daniel here is set in charge, not just in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, but we see Daniel as a political power in Belshazzar's kingdom. And now we see Daniel set in charge in yet a third empire. A third ruler. To where he's here, and in the first part here, they set up these satraps or governors throughout the whole kingdom. And over them, he put 3 presidents, as it were. Daniel was one of them. Daniel quickly rose to be the top president, the top prime minister of this government. So you've got Darius, the king, and then Daniel, second in command of this great empire, specifically here in Babylon, but overall. And as it were, that just with it happening with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, people began to plot against Daniel. They began to plot against Daniel in the same way they plotted against his 3 friends, is that they were in charge and they didn't like it. The Chaldeans at the time didn't like it, were identified for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they made up this thing that they pointed out that they weren't bowing down. But now we see this unnamed group of people. Not sure who it was, but they began to plot against Daniel because he distinguished himself. In verse 3, above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. They couldn't find anything or fault against him. Now we're talking about politically here. We're talking about socially, legally. These guys are trying to find something to point out and say, hey, look, Daniel's doing something bad here. Let's get him out of power because we want more power for us. They couldn't find anything. They didn't find any kind of legal ground to say Daniel's doing something wrong. And so they said, well, maybe we need to find something, some sort of reason to point a finger at him concerning his law of God. I'll point something out here. That maybe when we read this, kind of one of those little details like we commonly see and sort of read past and don't really think about, but consider Daniel's character here. That these guys couldn't find any kind of reason to say Daniel's doing something wrong. He wasn't living in a country or living in a government that allowed him to freely worship God the way he chose. He was living in a pagan society. He was living away from Jerusalem. And yet, he managed to obey the laws of the land. And what's more is that they had to make something up. They had to create a law for Daniel to break concerning his God. I think if Daniel was capable of doing that in the society that he lived in, I think we can too. I think we can live as Christians in the United States of America in 2018 and be Christians and worship God the way he wants us to and still be right in the eyes of the government and right in the eyes of God. So they made up this law. Hey, King Darius, we've got this great idea. For a certain period of time, nobody's going to be able to appeal to any other god except for you. And the Medes and the Persians, this empire, this vast empire, they looked at the king as God. Nobody's going to be able to appeal. They can worship their other gods, but except for this time period, they can only appeal to you as God. All right, sounds good to me. Let's make it official, though. And as it was, with the laws of the Medes and the Persians for other reasons that we don't have time to get into, and you might not even care. He couldn't change the law after he put the seal on it. Even though he's the ruler, he's the king, he's in charge. Once that seal went onto the law, he can't change it. Doesn't matter if he wants to. Doesn't matter if he has good reason to. Here's the law. Now he can make up another law to counteract it, but he couldn't get rid of that law. And so these guys thought they had Daniel. Nobody else. You can't pray to no other God except for King Darius. Well, Daniel heard this after he establishes this. And that was in verse 7 and verse 8. Made it to where it can't be changed. And then verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went into his house where he had his windows in the upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. And he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Daniel knew the law. He knew that he wasn't supposed to go and make any kind of prayers to other gods except for Darius. He knew the law. And the way it's written there, it's almost like, well, he heard the law, so now I'm going to go and defy it just because. I don't normally pray 3 times a day, but I'm going to go and do it because he tells me I can't. And a lot of times that's the way we think, isn't it? I'm going to do this now because you told me I can't. But that last little part there, as he had done previously. This wasn't something new that Daniel did. It's something that he regularly did. There's nothing in the old law that I know of that tells Israelites to go and pray three times a day facing Jerusalem. It's not there. That's possible and I'm wrong. But they're just told to have no other gods, to worship God only. And so it wasn't that Daniel had to do this. That's what he did. That was his habit. That was his practice. He went to go and pray to God 3 times a day because that's what he always did. And it didn't matter what the law was. It didn't matter that Darius had signed this irrevocable law that he can't do that. I'm going to do it because that's what I always did. It's what I've always done. And so I'm going to continue to do it regardless of what the law says. It's our habit to come here on Sunday morning and eat the Lord's Supper and sing songs of praises to God. Would it be wrong if there's a law that says all church buildings are banned? Would it be wrong for us to meet in somebody's house? I don't think so. Would it have been wrong? Would it have been sinful for Daniel to not pray to God 3 times a day? Or would it have been wrong for Daniel to just simply close the windows? Nobody can see me now. It's not like he was doing it out on the street corner anyway. He's in his upper room with the windows open. And so, were these guys, they clearly were waiting for him to do this. They knew his habits. Another testament to Daniel's character. That it wasn't just that he was right before men, but they knew that he was a man of God, that he went and prayed regularly. That they knew his habits enough to say, hey, let's make this law up because he won't be able to follow it. He'll either go against what he's always done with his God to obey, or he'll break Darius's law and he'll be thrown into a den of lions. It takes some either creativity or just sheer violence to come up with that kind of punishment anyway. I don't know, maybe that was the common punishment for breaking the king's law, to be fed to lions. But they knew Daniel's habits. Would it have been wrong for Daniel just to close the windows or just say, you know what, maybe I just won't pray, I'll just do it silently, to myself, with my eyes open? I think it would have been wrong for Daniel. It wasn't that he was going against some written law of God, but he would have offended his own conscience. This is what I always do, and I'm not going to allow some man and his law to tell me that I'm not going to pray to God. And so Daniel prayed, and they came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and pleading before God. Then they came near in verse 12 and said before the king concerning the injunction, "O king, did you not sign an injunction?" Hey, Remember what you said? Daniel, he's praying to his God, not you. So now he needs to be cast into the den of lions. The king answered and said that the thing stands fast according to the law of Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Now, we think back to Nebuchadnezzar. We think back to how he responded to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know that there was any difference in the way that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego lived to the way Daniel lives. We see how different, though, the response is. I don't think that it's really all that far-fetched to believe that Darius had heard about the handwriting on the wall. It's not like it happened to just one person saw it and wrote about it. There's a whole room full of people that were partying and saw this thing happen. It's not like there was only a couple people that saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into the fire and then come out. We're not talking about that many years. I would imagine that that's something that was passed around. That made the news. Darius probably heard about those things, knowing Daniel's connection here. This is just speculation. This isn't like the Bible tells us that Darius knew about those things. I think it maybe is a safe bet that he did. Look at his response, though, compared to Nebuchadnezzar, who got angry whenever Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, look, we don't care if you throw us in the fire. We might die. Our God's able to save us, but even if he doesn't, we can't worship this idol. Darius, on the other hand, after being told that it was Daniel who disobeyed this law, in verse 14, it says that he was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Because Daniel, you see, wasn't just this exile from Judah. The way these guys made him out to be. Oh, you know the slave Daniel? The guy from Judah? He doesn't care about what you say, king. That's not really who Daniel was, though. And Darius knew about it. Imagine the ruler of an empire that stretched from, I think it's like Egypt, almost over to China. I mean, encompassing India and Saudi Arabia, and all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea. It's a massive chunk of land. A lot of people, a lot of different people. The guy that's in charge of that is concerned with how he can rescue Daniel from the lions. What a character Daniel had. What a personality. What a guy that you want to be on your team. Darius is going to fast all night after he has to throw Daniel into the lions. So Daniel, he goes and he says, well, we got to do this. There's nothing I can do about it right now. And so he's fed to these lions. And after he fed them to the lions, they put this big stone in front of it, and he sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went into his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions, no distractions. He didn't turn on Netflix. He didn't read a book. He focused on Daniel's plight. He focused on the fact that Daniel, and I'll say that his friend Daniel. It's not like Daniel was just sort of some government official from a foreign land that he didn't really care about. You don't stay up all night worrying about that kind of thing. This guy's concerned with his friend. He's in anguish. Spent the night fasting. Nothing distracting him. He didn't sleep. And then at daybreak, the king arose and went in haste to the lion's den. Imagine, the president, it doesn't even fit here. That is so much more of a powerful, prestigious position than just the president of the United States. But imagine you being fed to the lions because of a law the president made, and then the president staying up all night because of your concern, and then running back to the den to see if you're all right. Darius did that. Darius is upset and concerned for his friend Daniel. And he goes, as soon as it's light, as soon as he can get away with opening up that tomb to see if Daniel's still alive, he goes. And he came near to the den where Daniel was, and he cried out in a tone of anguish. Can you hear? Can you feel the concern? This voice cracking, crying out, Daniel, are you there? Oh, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I've done no harm. Imagine the relief. Imagine the excitement on King Darius. But also imagine Daniel. We're not really told much about what Daniel said along the way to be thrown and fed to the lions. We kind of see this conversation with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as I mentioned a minute ago, and we know that the fiery furnace was heated up so much that the guys who threw them in died as they threw them in. And then we see the conversation a little bit afterwards, but we're not really told what happens with Daniel. I imagine the reason being, Daniel's 80 years old. This isn't his first rodeo. This isn't his first run-in in a trial of faith. He could have turned his back on God, made his life and his waning years easier. He could have simply closed the windows, changed his habit. But he had faith in God to the point where I'm going to be fed to lions. If this is my ticket off planet Earth, okay. But I kind of wonder if that's why we're not told exactly what happened with Daniel on the way. We know what happened with Daniel. He wasn't concerned. He wasn't in anguish all night. Imagine sitting in this pit in darkness with these lions all around. I remember as a kid seeing the little felt pictures, you'd stick up on the board. Okay? And the picture of Daniel in the lion's den, and all the lions sitting around, and he's petting one of them, I think, and then there's this angel sitting there. I don't know if he could visually see the angel that was there that shut the lion's mouth, or if maybe he just knew that because, well, he had this power of prophecy. Maybe he just assumed that's what happened. But Daniel comes out, and then the king commanded in verse 24 that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them, broke all their bones into pieces. It wasn't that the lions weren't hungry, so the wrong food wasn't in the hole. The wrong food wasn't in the pit. Daniel had done no wrong. These men had. Make the analogy here between the lion's den and heaven and hell. God's going to save us if we're faithful to him. Those who are not faithful will not be saved. King Darius, the main point I hope we take away from this. It's not that Daniel did some heroic deed. It's not that he went and marched into battle like Gideon with just 300 soldiers and defeated an army of over 120,000 men. That takes courage. It's not that he marched around walls of Jericho with nothing but horns and the Ark of the Covenant 7 times until the walls fell down. It takes a special kind of courage to do that. Daniel simply just lived his life according to the way God wants us to. As a result, he was punished maliciously for it. But in the end, look at what happened. The same thing that happened every single time there was some sort of persecution against these guys. the king of this giant and massive empire, wrote to all the peoples and nations in verse 25 in languages that dwelt on the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. All because Daniel refused to be bullied into not praying. The king of most of the known world sends a message out to many different languages and peoples, declaring what many of us would be ashamed to tell our next door neighbor. That God is the God of all, and his kingdom is going to last forever. Daniel let his light shine. Daniel was rewarded time and time again. Verse 28 there, so this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. That could read a couple of different ways, but essentially, to the end of Daniel's life, from the time we first meet him until the time he dies, he prospered. He prospered socially, economically. I mean, the guy that's in charge of the largest kingdom is going to be a rich guy, I would imagine. But what an enduring legacy for us to know that through it all, even if we don't physically prosper, even if we don't prosper financially, that God's going to look out for us if we remain faithful. You letting your light shine? The course of human events was altered because of men like Daniel. It can alter with us too. That one person, that one lost soul that we are the shining light makes all the difference in the world. Are you letting your light shine? The gospel is open. You can be a part of God's team. You can be saved from the mouth of the lion if you come and we stand and sing.